Listen closely. I am Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and a monumental shift in global power has just occurred right under our noses. A strategic bluff has been called, and the consequences are reshaping the world. A truly extraordinary event unfolded this week, yet mainstream media outlets have largely ignored its profound implications. Robert Kagan, arguably America's foremost neoconservative strategist and the intellectual architect behind nearly every U.S. regime change and military intervention since the 1990s, including Iraq and Libya, published a piece in The Atlantic conceding that Iran has essentially defeated the United States and Israel. Keep in mind, this assessment does not come from a progressive commentator, an anti-war activist, or a longtime critic of American military adventurism. This admission comes from a man who has spent 3 decades championing the aggressive global projection of American military force and insisting that the United States must impose its will on adversaries. When the very ideological founder of this military approach publicly admits defeat, it transcends mere political spin. We are witnessing an individual who has been strategically wrong for decades, finally colliding with an undeniable reality. However, the broader context makes this admission even more alarming. Recent data reveals that American inflation has surged to an annual rate of 3.8%. Concurrently, farm bankruptcies are skyrocketing to unprecedented levels in U.S. history. A staggering 70% of American agricultural producers report an inability to afford fertilizer at current market rates. The agricultural green revolution, which enabled the planet to sustain 8 billion people, is quietly unraveling before our eyes. Meanwhile, inside the White House, individuals with direct access report that the president remains isolated in an impenetrable bubble, shielded from the stark reality of these outcomes. Ultimately, this is the definitive account of a grand strategic bluff being called. It is the story of how the myth of decisive air power shattered a policy rooted in self-deception, how global wealth is rapidly shifting eastward due to American miscalculations, and the grim reality facing a president who lacks a viable exit strategy, while every remaining option leads to disaster. I am Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and this is the Global Insight Network. Stay with me as we connect these critical pieces. The architecture of a failed bluff to comprehend our current strategic predicament. One must analyze the origins of this conflict and the flawed assumptions that drove it into a brick wall. The foreign policy doctrine of Donald Trump has consistently relied on the art of the strategic bluff. The core concept involves projecting overwhelming force to convince an adversary that resisting is far costlier than complying. Once the target folds, the administration claims victory and moves on. Admittedly, this framework has yielded limited success against certain fragile governments such as Venezuela or against European allies susceptible to trade pressures. It has also extracted concessions in specific diplomatic arenas. Nevertheless, a glaring structural flaw always existed. This tactic only functions against adversaries who believe the bluff and lack the capacity to challenge it. Once deployed against a nation possessing authentic strategic depth, robust public support, credible military power, and the backing of global superpowers, the bluff transforms into a severe test. Iran chose to call that bluff, yielding undeniable results that even the policy's architects must now acknowledge. Insiders with access to senior administration circles confirmed that the initial expectation was a swift and decisive triumph. The prevailing theory assumed the Iranian government would crumble under military strikes while its citizens revolted. Strategists believed the global landscape would alter within weeks, with Project Freedom showcasing absolute American naval supremacy. Planners assumed that naval blockades, airstrikes, economic strangulation, and the looming threat of escalation would swiftly force Tehran to negotiate on American terms. Absolutely none of this materialized. The Iranian regime did not fracture. Instead, facing an external assault, the population unified, as nations historically do. The broader strategic picture remained unchanged, and Project Freedom was paused after merely 2 ships managed to transit. The naval blockade captured only a fraction of maritime traffic, as Iran successfully maintained its oil exports through 3 alternative routes. Furthermore, Regional energy experts note that the economic pressure campaign actually boosted Iranian oil revenues as global supply disruptions pushed prices high enough to offset any drop in export volume. With the bluff effectively called, the administration now faces a scenario its operational architecture was fundamentally unequipped to manage. In the aftermath of this failure, White House insiders report that a retroactive narrative is being manufactured, suggesting the president was manipulated into the conflict by faulty Israeli intelligence and political pressure. Behind closed doors, officials are claiming that better American intelligence would have averted these disastrous decisions. This narrative suffers from two fatal flaws. First, the historical record simply contradicts it. The administration did not enter this operation reluctantly. From the outset, senior figures, including those now claiming private descent, exhibited genuine enthusiasm for military engagement. The drive for this war was manufactured and sustained domestically, not imported. Second, even if this excuse were entirely true, it does absolutely nothing to alter the grim strategic reality. How we arrived at this juncture matters far less than how we navigate a situation where every potential path inflicts severe pain. The delusion of air supremacy, to grasp why this operation was doomed, we must examine a persistent self-delusion within American strategic thinking since the 1990s. The absolute faith in decisive air power. This mythology originated in the Balkans, where mid-90s American airstrikes were credited with breaking Serbian resistance and ending the Yugoslav conflict. A powerful narrative took root, insisting that precision munitions alone could shatter enemy resolve, rendering ground forces obsolete. The reality, however, was far more nuanced. British and French ground commanders understood that conventional artillery caused significantly more precise damage than the air campaign, a fact systematically erased from the American retelling. Unique ground conditions in Bosnia amplified the effects of air power conditions that would not replicate everywhere. Similarly, in Kosovo, the Serbian government surrendered not because American bombs destroyed its military. They complied because Russia withdrew its support in exchange for an economic arrangement, making continued Serbian resistance impossible. Air power played a role, but it was not the sole deciding factor. Yet, American strategic doctrine internalized the myth that bombs alone win wars. This exact delusion fueled the Iraq invasion, attributing Saddam Hussein's rapid defeat to air superiority rather than recognizing the Iraqi military's fundamental conventional weakness and lack of institutional resilience. Consequently, this same mythology underpinned the assumptions driving the Iranian operation. Planners calculated that since air power succeeded previously, it would succeed again. They assumed Iran's capable military would eventually shatter under sustained bombardment, just like forces in Serbia and Iraq. They believed that institutional and societal collapse was merely a matter of applying enough pressure over time. This fatal calculation ignored what makes Iran vastly different from prior targets. Iran is not a fragile government susceptible to fracturing under external stress. It does not rely on conventional exposed military structures easily neutralized from the sky. Having witnessed American tactics for decades, Iran spent 40 years specifically fortifying against this exact doctrine. Its military assets are dispersed, heavily hardened, and buried underground, while its missile arsenal is mobile and highly survivable. Moreover, the Iranian populace shares a collective trauma from the devastating Iran-Iraq War, an experience that forged immense national cohesion in the face of foreign aggression. Crucially, in 2025, Iran did not stand alone. It weathered the storm utilizing Russian technical expertise, Chinese financial backing, and a resilient alternative trade network built explicitly to bypass Western sanctions. American air power mythology finally collided with an adversary it could not break. Consequently, the U.S. is trapped with no clean exit, a deteriorating domestic economy, and an enemy that has proven its resilience. The cost of the echo chamber, a pressing question remains. Did the architects of this operation understand the immense challenge before committing? All available evidence suggests they did not. Pre-conflict intelligence regarding Iran was not entirely optimistic. Genuine experts on Iranian culture and military capabilities provided detailed assessments warning that airstrikes and sanctions would not yield rapid, decisive victories. However, these vital warnings never permeated the highest levels of decision-making. The leadership environment was systematically designed to reject any data contradicting their desired outcomes. This echo chamber effect is a recurring historical tragedy. From Vietnam to Iraq to Libya, every failed military campaign features this identical dynamic. Senior leaders establish a rigid belief about how a war will unfold. This dogma dictates how intelligence is processed, elevating data that confirms their bias. Meanwhile, contradictory evidence is diluted, suppressed, or outright banned from the Situation Room. Intelligence professionals quickly learn that presenting harsh truths jeopardizes their careers and access to power. This creates structural self-delusion, resulting in confident but disastrous decisions based on curated, incomplete information. The catastrophic consequences of this echo chamber are now ravaging the economy, with inflation climbing past 3.8%. Gasoline prices have surged well beyond pre-war levels, and the soaring cost of fertilizer is driving marginal farming operations into mass bankruptcy. The disruption of shipping in the Persian Gulf has triggered a domino effect, drastically inflating global food prices. These statistics represent devastating material costs inflicted upon ordinary citizens who had absolutely no say in launching this conflict. The struggling farmer bankrupt by fertilizer costs did not authorize this war. The family agonizing over weekly grocery bills never voted for these flawed assumptions. The workers across the global south facing starvation due to severed supply chains were never represented in the halls of power. While policymakers remain insulated inside their bubble, the public suffers the full brunt of their failures. The economic fallout demands rigorous analysis because it clearly illustrates our current reality and dictates how this crisis will ultimately conclude. An inflation rate of 3.8% represents the compounding devastation of Persian Gulf blockades, destroying complex global supply chains. Fertilizer provides the starkest example, as the production of essential nitrogen and phosphates requires cheap natural gas and relies heavily on Middle Eastern energy transit routes. When those vital routes are severed, fertilizer costs explode, instantly driving up agricultural overhead. When input costs exceed crop values, farms collapse. This widespread agricultural insolvency inevitably triggers a severe contraction in the global food supply. Data indicates that farm bankruptcies are approaching historic peaks, serving as a reliable leading indicator for massive political upheaval. Rural farming communities represent highly engaged voting blocs. When faced with systemic ruin, their outrage swiftly reshapes the political landscape during election cycles. Simultaneously, soaring diesel prices directly infect the entire economy. Every sector reliant on transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, shipping is forced to pass these exorbitant costs onto the consumer. This generates a persistent, pervasive inflation immune to standard central bank interventions. Furthermore, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, already dangerously depleted, lacks the capacity to mitigate this shock. The administration's choice to sell reserves to Europe at elevated spot prices, rather than shielding the domestic market, clearly prioritizes foreign relations over American economic relief. Understanding the political ramifications requires historical context. The massive inflation sparked by the 1970s oil crisis fundamentally altered American politics for an entire generation. The economic turmoil of the late Carter years triggered a seismic political shift that redefined governance for decades. Historically, runaway food inflation guarantees political instability and regime change across the globe. Intelligence forecasts warning that 40 to 50 global governments could face collapse due to these economic shocks are entirely realistic. These projections align perfectly with historical data regarding major supply chain collapses. Nations like India, burdened by fragile power grids and populations, highly vulnerable to food costs, are exceptionally at risk. Similarly, the entire global South, deeply reliant on affordable food commodities and imported fertilizers, faces catastrophic exposure. The profound political instability generated by this crisis cannot be mitigated by diplomatic rhetoric. Reversing this damage requires fully restoring global supply chains, which is only possible by ending or drastically restructuring the underlying conflict. The global pivot eastward stepping back from the battlefield, the long-term geopolitical damage is staggering. This conflict has fundamentally accelerated the transfer of global wealth and power away from the West. Historically, Columbus's 1492 voyage established a structural paradigm where resources flowing across the Atlantic fueled centuries of European and later American global dominance. The westward flow of gold, agriculture, and commerce built the bedrock of Western hegemony. That era has definitively ended, and the Persian Gulf conflict has rapidly accelerated its demise. Today, China stands as the undisputed engine of global economic growth, dominating manufacturing and international trade. The industrial epicenter of humanity has migrated eastward. Asia now commands the technological frontiers of the 21st century, from advanced battery manufacturing to rare earth processing. While this transition was already occurring, recent American miscalculations drastically accelerated the shift by demonstrating severe vulnerabilities to the observing world. That U.S. military power can be thwarted by a resolute enemy backed by geography and great power allies. That devastating economic sanctions cannot break nations possessing alternative trade networks. That American alliance guarantees are highly conditional, and that aligning with Washington risks enduring catastrophic economic collateral damage, such as soaring energy and food costs. Consequently, the Global South has not loudly announced a strategic realignment. Instead, they are quietly and methodically pivoting their diplomatic and commercial allegiances toward the more stable China-Russia axis. For 30 years, Beijing has successfully executed a strategy Washington finds impossible: avoiding unnecessary conflicts, conducting strictly business-oriented diplomacy without ideological strings attached, and forging infrastructure networks that foster mutual benefit rather than colonial dependency. The Belt and Road Initiative exemplifies this approach. It provides developing nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America with lucrative commercial partnerships free from the extreme geopolitical risks associated with American alignment. The Iranian crisis vividly proved the superiority of China's model to every watching government. The processing of rare earth elements perfectly illustrates this critical vulnerability. China firmly controls the vital supply chains required to manufacture modern American defense technology. The production of aircraft systems, electronic warfare platforms, and precision-guided munitions remains entirely dependent on materials processed by Beijing. China recognizes this immense leverage. By igniting a conflict that heavily impacts Chinese economic interests, the U.S. practically invites Beijing to weaponize this supply chain dependency. President Trump's anticipated diplomatic visit to Beijing was already fraught with complexity. Following this strategic disaster, his negotiating position has severely deteriorated. The United States' eagerness to weaponize its economic relationships has incentivized global partners to systematically decouple from American leverage and seek out alternatives free of political conditionality. Shattered arsenals and fractured alliances simultaneously, serious concerns regarding the depletion of American precision munitions must be addressed, as the implications stretch far beyond the Middle East. America's military supremacy relies on a triad of advanced platforms, highly refined doctrine, and massive inventories of precision weapons. The platforms, ships, planes, and missile systems take years to construct. The operational doctrine requires decades of institutional refinement. Meanwhile, the precision munitions themselves are exceedingly expensive, require complex supply chains, and cannot be rapidly restocked once exhausted. This current conflict has burned through these irreplaceable arsenals at an alarming rate. Prior operations against the Houthis had already significantly drained these stockpiles. This war has continued the relentless depletion against a target that remains unbroken. The issue is not the competence of the American warfighter. The critical issue is the loss of the massive munitions surplus that guaranteed sustained overwhelming superiority in high-intensity conflicts. Rebuilding this vital arsenal requires manufacturing capacity wholly dependent on the very rare earth elements China currently dominates. Yet, the collapse of global alliances is even more damaging than the munitions deficit. Despite intense lobbying, Washington has entirely failed to rally Asian partners to support this operation. South Korea refuses to jeopardize its vital commercial ties with China for a Persian Gulf conflict that offers zero strategic benefit. Japan holds an identical position, while Vietnam has definitively stated that escalating tensions does not align with its requirements for regional stability. Australia is fundamentally recalculating whether the exorbitant costs of American military alignment actually justify the benefits. This quiet rebellion, Asian allies outright refusing to support U.S. wars while accelerating strategic integration with China, signals a massive erosion of American influence that should terrify strategists far more than any tactical setback. The deployment of 40,000 U.S. troops in South Korea was intended to deter a specific threat that no longer exists in its original form. Beijing desperately wants to avoid a war on the Korean Peninsula. Moscow and Beijing are actively commanding North Korea to prevent any destabilizing provocations. Meanwhile, South Korea relies heavily on Chinese trade and strongly opposes serving as a launch pad for American conflicts that would ruin its economy. The U.S. military presence there made sense during the Cold War. Today, it is an obsolete deployment serving Washington's institutional vanity rather than the legitimate security interests of either nation. Recognizing this, Seoul is actively accelerating the timeline to reclaim full operational control of its military, a strategy paralyzed. Ultimately, the White House is cornered by a reality no amount of public relations can obscure. Every single available path leads to disaster. Restarting the bombing campaign guarantees further depletion of critical munitions, worsening global economic devastation, and the severe risk of pushing Iran to enrich uranium to weapons-grade levels. Tehran's public warnings regarding their nuclear posture are not empty threats. It is a purely logical reaction when facing comprehensive foreign annihilation. Alternatively, declaring a fake victory and retreating means absorbing the massive political humiliation of an outcome even neoconservatives label a defeat. The domestic political climate will fiercely punish this admission. Furthermore, retreating signals to the globe that American security guarantees evaporate the moment operations become challenging, permanently shattering international credibility. Maintaining a passive blockade only prolongs the brutal economic punishment inflicted upon American citizens, agriculture, and global supply chains without achieving any strategic breakthrough. Iran has proven perfectly capable of enduring this blockade, utilizing great power backing and alternative trade channels. The true victims of this stalemate are the innocent civilians far removed from the halls of power. Seeking a negotiated settlement requires public concessions that are politically toxic. Any deal Iran accepts now will merely formalize America's failure to achieve its military objectives. There is no dignified exit, nor is there a path back to the pre-war status quo, because that world has been destroyed. The catastrophic decisions made have permanently scarred the geopolitical landscape, yielding a solidified Iranian state, a highly emboldened China-Russia-Iran coalition, decimated American military credibility, dangerously depleted weapons stockpiles, fractured Asian alliances, and a spiraling economic crisis that will dominate American politics for years. At this juncture, the goal is no longer achieving victory. The agonizing reality is figuring out how to stop the bleeding while initiating a decades-long process to rebuild a fraction of the power we squandered. This recovery demands brutal honesty, an attribute completely absent in the echo chambers that authored this catastrophe. As of May 12, 2026, this is our reality. America's leading neoconservative voice has publicly declared an Iranian victory over the U.S. and Israel. The administration desperately weaves fiction to survive the political fallout. The economic devastation is concrete, manifesting as surging 3.8% inflation, collapsing American farms, prohibitive fertilizer costs, and an exploding global food crisis. These burdens crush ordinary people who were entirely sidelined during the decision-making process. Meanwhile, global dominance rapidly shifts east, drastically accelerated by American blunders. China emerges triumphant, its global prestige and strategic leverage vastly enhanced beyond anything American strategists feared. The intoxicating myth of air power supremacy has finally been crushed by a hardened adversary. The grand bluff failed, the Washington bubble remains intact, and the political establishment cannot fathom a viable retreat. The consequences for global non-proliferation, the recalibrating Asian alliances, and the stability of desperate nations crushed by soaring food and energy costs hinge on choices yet to be made. To survive, future decisions must be forged in the harsh light of reality, totally free from bureaucratic self-delusion. We must confront the undeniable facts, not the comforting fictions required by political narratives. I am Colonel Douglas Macgregor, and this is the Global Insight Network. No spin, no false hope, and absolutely no narrative manipulation, only the unvarnished truth necessary to understand our world. Subscribe and share this vital assessment with those who demand reality. Engage in the comments below where the genuine discourse occurs. Return tomorrow, because the decisions unfolding today dictate the survival of our next decade. Pay attention.